Okay, well, I think we should get started. So, hi, everybody. I'm Julia Lupton, and I am the faculty director of Illuminations. And this is our faculty book club. We're calling it Illuminaries, and we're celebrating authors that are on the UCI faculty and are contributing to arts and culture. And tonight, we're really happy to feature two UCI faculty, Hector Tobar and Alejandro Morales, in conversation about Hector's new book, The Last Great Road Bum. So Hector Tobar is a professor of literary journalism and Chicano Latino studies here at UCI. And this year, he is a Harvard Radcliffe Fellow, although he remains in residence in California, and he's attending activities at Harvard virtually. He is the author of 5 books published in 10 languages, including the New York Times bestseller, Deep Down Dark, The Untold Stories of 33 Men Buried in a Chilean Mine and the Miracle That Set Them Free. And he's also a contributing writer for the New York Times opinion pages. Alejandro Morales is professor of Spanish and Portuguese and film and media studies. He is a scholar and novelist whose works include River of Angels, The Ragdoll Plagues, Death of an Anglo, and The Brick People. So Alejandro and Hector are going to have a conversation about Hector's book. And you may post questions in the Q&A, and we will take them at the end. And if you would like closed captioning, it is available at the bottom of the screen. So The Last Great Road Bum is a fascinating historical and literary enterprise, which reconstructs the travels of a failed writer and global adventurer named Joe Sanderson in the 1960s and early 70s. Before I started reading the book, I wasn't exactly sure what a road bum was. Then, as I got into it, I realized that I had been kind of on a road trip many decades ago. In 1971, when my twin sister and I were about 8 years old, my hippie parents bought a beat-up VW van and drove it across the country from Baltimore to California. There were no seats in the back, let alone seat belts, and a lot of nights with the 4 of us on a mattress in the back of that van. When we got to the West Coast, my mother took her clothes off, swam in the Pacific, and then sold the van, and we bought plane tickets home. They were divorced a few years later. I don't think the road trip helped their marriage. On the plane, we saw Zeffirelli's film of Romeo and Juliet. So that trip was my first introduction to California, to air travel, and to the works of William Shakespeare. Hector's book, in its own way, brought all this back to me. And so thank you for this opportunity to travel down memory lane. So Alejandro, Hector, it's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Julia, for inviting us, for inviting me to do this this interview and this chit chat with Hector. I'd like to, first of all, Hector, to start, I'd like to congratulate you on this excellent book. It's a masterful work. It's complex. It's beautifully written, and it raises a lot of questions, some controversial questions that we're going to talk about a little bit here. One of the things that I'd like for you to start to tell us about who was Joe Sanderson. Tell us a little bit about him. Some of the people who have not read the book or read any of the publicity that was sent out before the book would really like to know, who is Joe Sanderson?
Well, first of all, thank you, Alejandro, for agreeing to do this and for being part of this event. And thank you to Julia and to Illuminations for inviting me. It's a great honor to be part of this program that has brought so much culture to our students in our campus. So Joe Sanderson. Joe Sanderson was a real person who was born in the early 1940s, 1942, I believe, yes, and died in 1982. In El Salvador. And when I first heard about Joe Sanderson, he was this legend. He was the Norteamericano, the gringo, who had died fighting with the leftist rebels in El Salvador, specifically in the Morazan province in northeastern El Salvador. And so I wrote a story about him for the Los Angeles Times that appeared in 2008. And as part of that story, I went to go interview Joe's brother, Steve, who at that time lived in South Carolina. Steve and Joe had both grown up in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, where their father was a university professor, their mother was an accountant. And Steve told me essentially the full story of Joe's life, which was that before Joe had gone to fight in El Salvador in 1979, when he was in his late 30s, he had spent about 20 years of his life hitchhiking around the world. And Steve very kindly opened up his archives. Steve had a huge collection of the letters that Joe had written home during his travels, mostly to his mother and to his father and to his family, describing his travels. And so Joe, starting in about 1962, had dropped out of college and spent 20 years really circling the globe as what he called a road bum. A road bum is sort of like a combination of the bums of the Jack Kerouac beat era with sort of like the hippies, free love movement of the 1970s, right? 1960s and 70s. So Joe is this guy who believed in hitting the road, getting by with as little as he could, spending very little money, trying to get free meals whenever he could, finding the cheapest way to travel, working. Actually, he would work at home in Illinois. He would paint flagpoles, and then save up his money and go on these incredible hitchhiking trips. I mean, he circled the globe twice. And as he got older, he told himself he was actually searching for action, for adventures that he would put in his novels, because he was also trying to write novels. So Joe Sanderson's idea of how you wrote a novel, because he loved literature, he loved especially Hemingway and James Jones and all of these sort of classic male writers of the mid 20th century. His idea of the way you wrote a novel was you went out and you had an adventure, right? You went to a country that was having a revolution. You lived with the poorest people. He lived with Rastafarians in Jamaica, for example. You go and you see some horrible tragedy. He went to Nigeria during the civil war that caused this mass starvation, in the Biafra area of Nigeria that had separated. So he went and had all these adventures and tried to write novels about them. And so as I, delved deeper into this incredible cache of material that Steve Sanderson had saved from his brother's life, I realized, my God, this is an incredible book. I mean, this is a book waiting to be written. This is the story from one man's perspective of the United States and its empire and its imperial ambitions and the world that the United States tried to shape and influence and in certain ways dominate in the middle of the 20th century. And so that's who Joe Sanderson was.
Okay, very good. Let me ask you a couple of questions about the publicity before the book came out,
right?
And, which also kind of they identify Joe Sanderson. They all this publicity kind of, how would I say, sets up a contract between the reader and the book itself. So this social contract. And one of the things that was mentioned that they described him as an American hero, and then I'm wondering, after I finish, I want you to comment on whether he was a hero or not, really. And then they describe him as he's compared to Che Guevara, to Jack Kerouac, to Ernest Hemingway, and in other adventurers like that. And I want you to comment about that as well. The other thing, they also described him as a failed novelist, a failed writer, and I wonder what he what he wrote thousands of pages into the publicity. So I'm wondering whether he was a failed writer, and why would somebody consider him that? The other thing is, in kind of looking at some of the people he was compared to, such as Guevara and Kerouac and Hemingway, and the way Joe Sanderson died, I started to dig up some information on these three men. It's Kerouac and Ernest and Guevara, and their deaths. Guevara ended up dying at he was the target of a firing squad in Colombia.
Right.
And Kerouac died of alcoholism. One time I think he said that because he was a Catholic, he couldn't commit suicide. So he said, I will go ahead and drink myself to death. And that's exactly what he did. Hemingway died a suicide. And in looking at Sanderson's death, which was it happened during when he was they're running away from the junta military, and they were fighting on him, they were shooting on him along with the other comrades, and one of the things was his name was not Joe, his name was Lucas, right? The name that the FMLN gave him. But anyway, he's running away and he sees these bullets just coming across, so many, and there are more and more bullets coming. So they decide, he and someone else, one of his comrades, they jump into this sort of a little ravine, maybe, and they didn't know how deep it was. They just jumped in there, and this is what really kind of I want you to answer. He lands, excuse me for saying this, but on human excrement.
Right.
And he's just trying to take this stuff off of him, but he really can't. He immediately after a while start running again, but he's full of this excrement. And then all of a sudden he feels something at his side, his lower side, left side, I think it was, and something warm, and it happened to be shrapnel from a mortar that was fired. He keeps running, but at the same time, he collapses, and you could hear his comrades yelling, "Cayó Lucas, cayó Lucas, cayó Lucas," and they all gather around him, and they take him to a medic, maybe a mile away or so, when relatively they're safe. But he dies. He bleeds to death. And what I'd like for you to comment is on these three things, but especially the idea of excrement. What is excrement? Right? Is it symbolic? Is it does Latin American, Central American culture have some mythological, with this? So why don't you start first of all with American hero, New England?
Right. I'm sort of here taking notes. So I would, I think that, a hero is someone who has this huge adventure, who's tested, who has to rely on his courage and his wits, and does something that a lot of people wouldn't do. And I think in many ways that describes, Joe Sanderson. I don't know that his motives were always heroic. I know Joe was really, I think, first when he started in his trips, he was really interested in having a good time, in enjoying the road, in going, when you're young and you can just go anywhere you want, and there's a sense of power and freedom. I think that's really what drove Joe primarily at the beginning. Later, he became a little bit more idealistic. He became idealistic because the road changed his perspective. It changed the way that he saw the world. He understood, I think, how privileged he was. And I think he understood this more than the vast majority of Americans of his time, right? Of the middle of the 20th century. He understood what it meant to be a member of the American middle class or a white man and to have these privileges when he saw the violence and the poverty and the lack of democracy, the authoritarianism, in all these countries that he visited. And so when he joins the rebels, it's this underground movement. So he has to pick a name. He picks the name Lucas to go by. Joe picked that name, and I spent, many, many years working on this novel, actually, off and on for 10 years. And for many years, I did not know why. I couldn't ask Joe, why did you pick the name Lucas? And, I thought maybe you had some sort of religious significance. And then I met a man named Lucas, and I said, "Hey, your name is the same name as the guy in my novel." And he said, and he was kind of embarrassed. He said, "To tell you the truth, I'm named after the character of the Rifleman television show, who's this guy Lucas, this gunman, right, who rights wrongs with his rifle." And I thought, oh my God, of course. And that television show was on TV when Joe was a teenager, when he was an adolescent. So of course he would have seen it, right? And so Lucas, Joe was also an excellent shot, excellent with a rifle, excellent with any handgun. I think that all those things sort of qualify for being a hero. I know that when I was in El Salvador and I interviewed these former rebels who had fought alongside him and seen him die, one of them said to me, this Joe, he's buried by the side of the river here. We buried him when he died, after he was wounded. And we can show you where he's buried. But you know what? One of them told me he should be buried in that cemetery where all your soldiers are buried. That one, that's in Virginia. And of course, he meant Arlington, right? So that's how they viewed him. They definitely viewed him heroically. Now, you talked about the publicity and it's the book has been.
Let me just can I interrupt you? I want to add one little thing about this American hero, and he was fighting against that were trained by American soldiers, American advisors that were there. And I'm not justifying this, but I think this is somewhat of a contradiction in the eyes of he's a hero in the eyes of some American people, because there was a lot of people involved who supported what was happening in Central America. They supported the rebels, just like many people here in the United States supported the Cuban rebels, et cetera, and so forth. But yet, in the eyes of other people, he may not be considered a hero.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's no doubt about that.
Excuse me, they would consider.
Yeah, but I don't think there is anything in his biography that suggests that he was a mercenary, because a mercenary is someone who fights for money. Now, funny thing, Joe did meet mercenaries. He met mercenaries when he was in the Congo.
Paid, but throughout his whole life, as he did all his adventures, he looked for two things, right? And he had faith that somehow he would be provided with shelter,
right?
Provided with food. And when he met these fellas to get into the FMLN, that's exactly what he gave him. And they sheltered him, and they took care of him, et cetera, et cetera. And then in turn helped them. He taught him how to swim, he taught him how to shoot, et cetera, et cetera. So there is this kind of a contradictory situation, I think, with his participation in, with the FMLN. So that's,
of course, absolutely. I mean, also you have to, you're not even mentioning that, Joe had an ulterior motive, which is that he wanted to be a writer. So he imagined that part of the outcome of this adventure would be that he would end up famous. And why did Joe want to be, a writer? Why did Joe want to have that particular fame, of having a book with your name on it, right? Which is, here's the book that has my name on it, but it has Joe's picture. Because he felt in many ways, and all of us writers could identify with this, he felt a little inadequate. His brother was successful, his father was a university professor, his mother had graduated from college. Joe Joe wasn't able to graduate from college, he dropped out. So for him, writing this book, the book that he never managed to finish, I mean, the one and he wrote a book about Nigeria that didn't sell. He never managed to sell a book or publish a book in his lifetime. He was just trying to show his mother that he was a serious person. He was trying to impress his mother. He was trying to show his parents, look, I'm not just doing this because I'm a screw up. I'm doing this because I'm going to be a writer one day. So he had an ulterior motive. That's absolutely true. And that's, I think, comes out in the book, that's Kerouac. Kerouac had also, he has this adventure. You mentioned him. And that is related on the road. Well, Kerouac also wanted to be a writer. And I think, there's a lot of similarities between the two of them. But Kerouac also finds friendship and companionship on the road, has all these incredible romances that take place on the road. He watches other people fall in love. And for Joe, too, that was part of the appeal of the road, was that he was going to go out, and he fell in love many, many times. My editor actually asked me to cut back on the girlfriends in the novel because there were so many, right? He ends up also like a Che Guevara, he ends up starting off, on this adventure, solitary adventure, like Che Guevara does when he leaves Buenos Aires, hitchhiking, and he ends up, talking his way into a rebel army, and a rebel army whose purpose it is to start a revolution, to overthrow a government. And Joe really embraced that cause. I mean, I think it's obvious in the novel, it's obvious in his letters home, that he embraced this idea that government, that dictatorship in El Salvador had to fall. So all of those things, compare him to those people. And then finally, the failed writer. You asked about him being a failed writer. He was absolutely failed in the sense that he never published a novel, despite a half a dozen tries. But I think that his great literary success and what really made him a writer were his letters home. And the letters, of course, are quoted extensively. They are an incredible source of insight into the world of the mid-20th century. And everything, everything in the novel, almost everything in the novel more or less happened. Some of it I had to fictionalize, but it's based on interviews that I did. A lot of things, there are many, many scenes that are invented, but a big chunk of it, of the facts in it, are actual things that happened. So for example, Joe falling into that pit of excrement that you mentioned at the end of the novel, that sounds like some, wonderfully symbolic thing that I invented, but that's what Santiago, Joe's fellow gorilla, told me happened. He's the one who told me that story with a smile on his face, because, he was able to say, Joe, caímos en la mierda, right? In Spanish. And so, anyways, yeah. So Joe was failed in that he wasn't able to write his novel, but he was very successful in the sense that he had a tremendous life that I think has made for a heck of a novel.
Okay. Let me go on with another idea here about the research you did. Now,
Yes.
To me, I think to write a book like this, you have to do quite a lot of research, and you did. And you went to San Salvador. You went to the Museo de la Palabra y de la Imagen. And I'm wondering what you found there, and did you, people in the publicity, they said that Joe Sanderson wrote thousands of pages. And what you found, basically, did you find a lot of his writing, or did you find the what was only in that backpack when the day that he died? He had material there. He had I think a diary there and so forth. So what did you find at that museum?
Yeah, well, that was the first thing that I found. I mean, and that was originally what drew me to the story, was that I had heard that Joe Sanderson, Lucas, had left behind this diary. And so the rebels during the war were actually maintaining their archive and sending off documents, sending off tapes of their radio broadcasts. They were sending them to Nicaragua, they were sending them to Honduras to hide them and preserve them, right, as a record of the revolution. So among those things they preserved was the diary that was on Joe's back when he was killed, which was approximately 300 and almost 400 pages, handwritten, single-spaced, right, in a notebook, taking advantage of every little space because the paper was precious that he was carrying on his back. But in addition to that diary that was found, I learned by reading Joe's diary that he had others that were lost. One was lost, probably burned when the army came and invaded the rebel-controlled territory. He had another one that he hid in a safe house in La Libertad, a port town where he was hiding for a while. I have no idea if it's still there and hidden up. He hid it in the ceiling, right? I don't know if anybody ever found that. And in addition to that, as I discovered later, he had these hundreds of letters that he wrote home, and the manuscripts of his 6 or 7 novels, each of which was about 300 or 400 pages. He had many drafts, sometimes a couple of different drafts of each novel. So he had an incredible sort of treasure trove of documents. Now, in addition to that, you mentioned research. I interviewed people. I mean, that's sort of what I've been doing. I was a daily journalist for 20 years, and I love interviewing people. And so I interviewed these former rebels in El Salvador. I interviewed Joe's best friend in Champaign-Urbana, and of course, I interviewed Steve. Before he died, I interviewed Milt Sanderson, Joe's father, who was about 100 or so years old when I interviewed him. And that was an incredible sort of source of the emotional world of this young man, of Joe as a young man. Milt described his son as a bookish, very shy, kind of quiet kid who, always was kind of vulnerable. As fathers, we see the things that threaten our kids. And I think that Milt really saw vulnerability in Joe that Joe never quite overcame. Mm-hmm. So yes, much research.
What about what about Steve? I think that I believe Steve considered his brother a hippie. He's and at one time,
right? Yeah.
He says once a hippie, always a hippie, and he's living the hippie life kind of by his adventures and so forth.
Well, you know how family is. 2 parents can come together and have multiple kids, and the kids turn out radically different one from the next, right? And this is what happened in the Sanderson family. There were 2 boys that Milt and Virginia Sanderson had. Steve was the older one, a little bit taller than Joe. Joe was the younger one. Steve, lifelong conservative in the sense of his lifestyle, as someone who sort of followed the rules, who got a university job at a relatively young age and kept it for the rest of his life until he retired, right? He's now retired, and I think he's in on this call. So you are, hello, Steve. Great to see you again. And Steve, Steve is a Republican, a lifelong Republican. And Joe was a Republican as a kid, right? Actually, as a kid, supported Nixon in the election against against Kennedy in 1960. Actually, has fantasies, I think, about joining the anti-Castro Cubans, guerrilla fighters in the early 1960s, and then throughout his life, undergoes this conversion and ends up becoming, joining a Marxist rebel army. So that I definitely interviewed Steve. And, I learned a lot about their relationship, and I learned a lot about Joe. Joe wasn't always respectful to his older brother. But they loved each other. I mean, they loved each other to death. I mean, they just, one of Steve's final conversations with Joe was telling him, look, brother, if you want to stop wandering, I can get you a job here in Champaign-Urbana. I can get you a job at the bookstore. I can get you a job at the newspaper. I can get you a job at the bank, which is exactly what Joe did not want. But, Steve, that was what he had to offer. He said, look, if you want, here's the opportunity. So there was a very, very deep bond between the brothers. And that's part of what this novel is about. It's also about Joe's relationship with his parents, and so family really is the center of this crazy book.
Mm-hmm. After all that research and so forth and travel that you did to find, information about family and about him in Central America, it was the research enough for you to tell the story of Joe of Sanderson enough. And what I'm asking you here, mm-hmm. I'm sure, well, yes. Maybe you haven't, but people would ask, well, how you from a Latinx background, Guatemala ancestry, et cetera, how can you tell a story from the point of view of or about this American guy, this
white guy? Yeah. I don't think research is enough. I mean, that's why I did not write this as a nonfiction book, is because I tried to write a nonfiction book about Joe Sanderson, and it just didn't come alive. He always came off as kind of sad and pathetic. The whole failure part, sort of, when you try to write just the facts, that's what you sort of see. It's like he didn't publish the book. He died in battle trying to capture a machine gun. You see all the tragedy of it, and the life of him really only came when I decided I would write this as a novel. Let me be the 11-year-old boy collecting butterflies, which is how the novel starts. Let me be that person. Let me be him. Let me be the man who's trying to seduce this beautiful Portuguese woman he meets on a cruise ship between Rio and Lisbon, right? Let me be that person. Let me be also the gorillas. Let me be these gorillas looking at this odd, very tall, blonde, blue-eyed gringo, among them. Let me be the gorillas, and and I'm very, very proud of these passages. Well, it's actually half the novel. Half the novel takes place in El Salvador, and so I think that's where Joe starts to come alive as he started to come alive as a person for me, because you find points of identification that go across, our ethnicity. Our ethnicities are stories we tell each other about ourselves, right? But they really are just stories, there's stories and there's, discrimination and prejudice, but there's this common humanity that sort of links us in these ways. And I so much enjoyed, tapping into Joe in the different ways that I could, and to his family. I was an American boy who grew up in the late 1960s and the early 1970s in the United States, when it was like we thought the world belonged to us. We were landing people on the moon. America was like it was a shiny metal object, that could do no wrong if you were a little kid. That's the way you saw it. And so I remember that, and I tried to tap into that, in the first part of the novel. So to me, part of it, it's not just the research. It's tapping into your own humanity, tapping into the emotional world of the book, and trying to lose yourself in it. And that requires all different kinds of sort of like, emotional sort of tricks that you play on yourself.
Let's talk a little bit now about the actual writing of the book, the construction.
Yes.
And as I read it, and it's based on the life of Joe Sanderson.
Right,
So
right.
this is a biographical novel, and I've written 3 or 4 biographical novels, and some using a lot of the genres of life narrative, let's say, autobiographical narratives and so forth. But in this book, what I find really challenging about it, and I think groundbreaking about it, is you use so many life narrative genres in it. And I don't know whether you realize how many you've used, but let me just, I've counted about 15 of these,
Oh, really?
such as biography, autobiography, what else? Diary, ethnocriticism, a journal, travel logs, travel narratives, war memoirs, etc., and then ethnographical scenes and so forth. So how do you keep all of that? How do you put all that together? And as you read the book, there's so many voices that come into play in this novel. So how did you manage all that?
Well, part of it is, just the joy of discovery. I think for me, the years that I spent on this project were just one sort of wonderful thing that I discovered that I could lose myself in. Today, I'm going to write about Chicago. I spent a couple of weeks writing a single paragraph about Chicago, and I'm very proud of that paragraph when Joe returns from Jamaica to Chicago. And so each thing is this little piece of the world or this little piece of humanity that you lose yourself in. And it's wonderful to try to find the language. It's wonderful to try to sort of to enter those emotional spaces. It requires tapping into the old soul inside of you, which becomes easier as you become older,
Mm-hmm.
and there's that part of it. What was the other part of your question? It was about, I'm sorry, you said, what else did you say? You asked about the writing of it and,
Well, how do you manage all these?
and how do you manage? Yes, that's the other part of it. Yeah, I think it's, well, first of all, I think when you first do it, you just do too much. And so I produced a first draft of this that was 200,000 words, and the final product was 120,000. So then what you end up doing is you end up just being extremely disciplined. So there's a part of you, and I tell this to my writing students, there's a part of you that's totally joyful and playful and wants to write anything and has so much fun. And then you also have to be the other person, the other part of you, which is the disciplined, editor. You're editing yourself. Most of 95% of the editing that goes into a novel, as publishing houses, they're just basically doing the last part of it because you have to be your own editor. And so it's, paring away, being really disciplined. Is this really necessary? And so there's that part of the experience, and also just wanting it to move forward. I think one of the things that I learned from writing at newspapers was what a beautiful and powerful thing it is to have people want to read and turn the page and how to keep them reading. And so from having been at newspapers and you can actually talk to people who call you up like the same day that it comes out, hey, Mr. Tobar, I read your story, da-da-da-da-da. And so you learn how things connect with people. And so, that part of me also wants to sort of pity the reader and keep them with me and not lose them and fight to keep them with me. And so that part of me is cutting and polishing and whatever. So I think, trying to keep that sort of momentum through it is very, very important, even though sometimes I just want to wander and linger and stay in one place. At this, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that you do that I found I really liked it a lot. And this is the interventions in the manuscript of Joe Sanderson himself. Uh-huh. You raised him from the dead in a sense, right? And gave him, because I read one of the drafts.
Yes.
I didn't final. This is a draft, and so a lot of these women you talked about earlier are still.
No, just a couple.
But let me finish with this one.
Yeah.
You allowed you gave Joe Sanderson voice, mm-hmm. and you placed him in the body of the main writing. In other words, you would read a section, all of a sudden he interrupts, right? And Joe Sanderson says, "Well, what the hell is this guy doing?" to my life. He's writing about me, but it didn't happen necessarily that way, etc. So he criticizes the author, right? And then me, I feel when I was reading the manuscript that I was right next to Joe Sanderson reading along.
Mm-hmm.
That to me was such a great.
It's still in there, Alejandro.
Wait, hang on. A voice, right? This move you did here, that you allow him to speak. Then I pick up the final published form, right? And again, you raised him from the dead. You dug him up and gave him life, gave him a voice. And then where do I find Joe Sanderson? I find him in minute little footnotes down there. I can barely read. I almost need to some help. I have to put double my glasses or something, right? And why that?
Well, that was my decision.
You literally buried him under thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of words again. And he was with us.
No, I think that, it's really difficult to construct a novel and have people sort of, be able to follow the events in it. And I had originally written a preface that was entirely Joe in the first person. And it was a little confusing because, Joe, it looked like the whole novel was going to be that way. And so I made a decision. I really like the idea of Joe commenting on the novel from the footnotes. I liked him physically down there because it was, in a certain sense, analogous to his situation in real life. In real life, Joe is dead. In real life, he doesn't have, I'm the person who's in control. In fact, all those footnotes in which he's speaking is me writing. And I really like the idea of having him be in the footnotes. And then at the end, as you were sort of alluded to, at the end, Joe bursts out from the footnotes because there's one entire section of the novel which is entirely written by Joe with just my editing. And he is able to say at the end of that passage, at last, I'm a published writer. Right. And that to me was really wonderful that after, let me see, he started trying to write novels in 1960. So after 60 years, Joe Sanderson finally becomes a published writer of literature. And I just so much enjoyed quoting from, and it's a letter that describes the situation that really does sound a lot like something from an Ernest Hemingway novel from Who the Bell Tolls, in which these rebels are debating whether or not they should execute a group of prisoners. And it's just really a wonderful, almost like a fable. And that's all told entirely from one of Joe's letters.
Very good. I have two more questions. Then we can hopefully do questions from the audience. One is comment on Mafalda. Is that Portuguese lady, which I found her fascinating, And then also, I saw her almost like his mother, or not that she was doing that role, but she, right. she followed him, et cetera, was worried about him, and then just like his mom, Virginia, she also kind of bailed him out at times, right? And so I saw that while relationships were different with other women that he had throughout the novel. But Mafalda to me was really fascinating woman.
Yes, I had the great thanks to Steve, who introduced me to her. I was able to interview Mafalda, who doesn't want her last name printed, or so I'm not going to say it, and it's not in the book because she asked me not to have her last name. So she had this relationship with Joe, starting in the mid 1960s. And it was sort of like a long distance relationship. They wrote letters to each other. They actually met each other, I think it was 3 times. In the novel, it's just twice, but in real life, they met each other 3 times. And she was just, it was the love affair of her life. She'd been married and had children and other relationships. When I met her, she was married, had been married for many, many years. But this relationship to her was very special, and she had saved all of Joe's letters. And she also was very, and also I have to say that the letters that Joe wrote to Mafalda were different from the letters he wrote to his family. They were much more romantic, and they revealed parts of himself that he didn't reveal in his letters or even in his diary sometimes. And I thought that was really, really important. He wrote to her this beautiful letter from Morocco about his hallucinations, and after doing hashish and also opium in Morocco on his travels. And so, it was really wonderful to meet her. I met her several times. Whenever she came out to Los Angeles, we'd have coffee and talk. And, it was, she told me she was still deeply in love with him. And, I knew that he had many relationships that were meaningful to him, but it was nice to see this from a woman's perspective, frankly, which was also, like you say, part motherly, part like, this man does not have his act entirely together, so yeah, absolutely. That was a very important.
And the last question I have is, or a comment, but I want you to respond to it. And some people might read this novel, not all of an American hero, but of an American tragedy. Could you see that?
No, I think there's definitely a tragic element to this, because we have a family that goes through the terrible loss. His mother is relatively young. She is, I believe, in her early 60s when Joe dies, and she, and think of it, she never really learned, because she died 4 years after Joe did. She never really learned how Joe died, or never did she receive any official or, concrete confirmation of his death. She did not know how he died. She did not know where he was buried. As I read in the novel, the most concrete proof that Joe had died was the fact that he no longer was writing letters to her. So Virginia Sanderson, her relationship with her son for 20 years had been going to the mailbox and retrieving these letters and writing letters back to him. And the end of the last several years of her life, she typed out these letters, and I have carbon copies of the letters she wrote to Joe, right? That Steve has also kept. And also very beautiful, very beautiful sort of slice of life of a Midwestern college town in the 1970s, and her, raising her niece, helping to raise her niece. So absolutely, I think, for Steve to lose his brother was very traumatic to him, and we all go through these things too. When we lose someone, we feel partly responsible. Steve had to reflect on his own relationship with his brother, the things that happen between brothers. Brothers fight, brothers say mean things to each other. Joe said mean things to Steve on more than one occasion, back and forth, and those things are left unsettled. And so part of that is definitely a tragedy. I feel that one of the things that the book did in terms of real human relationships was that this book, actually, in doing this book, I was able to tell both Milt, who's still alive, and Steve, I was able to tell them exactly how Joe died. I was able to give them a portrait of Joe's final years, right? Mm-hmm. And pass that on. And Steve told me, and it's in the the epilogue to the book, that he didn't really, up until the moment I told him all those things, Steve still had in his back of his mind this idea that maybe Joe would come up at the door one day and come knocking at the door. Because we know, as you know, this is a very common thing. When you lose someone that way, when there is this open-ended death where you never really know, if someone goes missing, it's a very common sort of story in the United States. So in that sense, it's definitely, there are a lot of tragic elements. But to me, the part that saves it from being maudlin, that saves it from being the heavy story, is Joe's joie de vivre, his joy of living. The way he approached everything he did it sort of completely. And Joe really, I think he overcame something which I don't think I've entirely overcome in my life, which is that Joe was a very solitary person. He was very shy. And part of his way of dealing with shyness was to constantly sort of be moving. And he writes about this in his journal. He's amidst all these rebels, these teenage fighters. They're all in this cause. He's the outsider. He separates himself from them, feels the need to be off on his own, writing into his journal. But when they tell him, hey, boss, vení acá, come and join us, and we're going to sing a song, Joe would join them. He was, grateful to be pulled in. And in that sense, Joe overcame that. He overcame his insecurities. He attacked his insecurities. And in that sense, it's a triumph. It's a beautiful sort of story of success, on that very basic human level. of achieving something you did not think was possible, of becoming a kind of person that you did not know you could become. And Joe Sanderson did that. And I think to me, that's what makes it almost, it has these sort of celebratory tones to me all throughout the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, what questions for the audience, but thank you so much for writing such a wonderful, wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you.
Congratulations.
And that was such a beautiful final exchange there, that your comments on the humanity and the achievement that Joe did have, and the way that your book helped realize that achievement posthumously. The idea of this book as a gift to Steve is just really, really beautiful. I do want to acknowledge that Steve Sanderson is here zooming in from Boca Raton, Florida. So welcome, Steve, and thank you for being part of this adventure in reconstructing a life and creating a memoir. I listened to this on Audible. I have to recommend the Audible recording is excellent. The guy who reads it has a wonderful Midwestern accent, but he's also fluent in Spanish, and he does great stuff throughout. So I didn't realize that Joe's voice was in footnotes. I was hearing it differently. So it was quite interesting to hear you discuss the print version. We have a question here from Natalie Bonilla. She says, thank you for this event. My parents are Salvadoran, so your book has really caught my interest, and I hope to find time to read it soon. You said it took you 10 years to write the book. I was wondering if you could share how you stayed motivated throughout the process.
Well, thank you, Natalie. It's a wonderful question, and I think there's a lot of El Salvador in this book. There's a lot of Central America. There's a lot of the characters actually speak in Central American Spanish, so the accents look like they're not in where they're supposed to go, but that's because it's Central American Spanish. So staying, motivated through a long process. Well, I also wrote a novel called The Barbarian Nurseries, which was my third book, which basically I finished the first draft on the day my wife went into labor with our son, and it was published when he was a sophomore in high school. So that little boy who was in his mother's womb when I finished the first draft, when it was published, he asked a question at my first reading, at Chatterton's. So books can take a really long time. That's my way of saying that books can take a long time, as Alejandro will also attest to, and Julia, you yourself also know. Books are a slow process. They're kind of like, of all the cultural products in the American sort of, variety of cultural products, film, television, books are the ones that move the slowest. They move in geological time, So to me, I think staying motivated, it's all about every day that you write is a day in which you tackle one problem, you tackle the one paragraph or you tackle the one scene, and you try to find satisfaction in conquering that one little thing that you have to tackle. So you have this so it becomes like a lifestyle. You tell yourself you're headed towards its destination. And in this book, I knew the book would end with Joe's death. And I actually knew what the last words of the book would be for many, many years, which was, waiting to be read. Waiting to be read. Joe's works waiting to be read. That was going to be my last sentence, and it was my last sentence. And so that's like this thing far off in the distance, It's like when you first set off to college, you set off to college, you're a freshman, and you can think off in the distance of what graduation will be like. But when you're still a freshman, really all you're concerned about is getting good grades in your classes and maybe having a beer, right, or two. And so you live each day that way. And so writing a book becomes this process where you just sort of live each day with the one little thing you have to conquer. And so for example, just writing a scene. Writing this one scene that I knew of when Joe was leading these refugees away from this massacre in El Salvador. Then I wrote over the course of one day. That day I was on a roll. I was in the zone, right? And I just wrote all of that in one day. It was like, 800 words, and it was just, but that's one out of every 100 days are like that. And the other 99 days are one like where you have an idea and you kind of stumble forward and the sentences aren't really coming out of you and you just keep on revising over and over again. That's what most days are like. And what happens is that you end up revising and revising and revising to capture the sense, the illusion that you're this brilliant person and everything came out all at once. That's basically the way that, writing a book is an illusion that way. So that's how you get through it. And it becomes like this. It also, I have to say, it becomes easier when you've written books before, when you've spent a couple of years writing a book and it's a slow process. When you've spent 5 or 6 years, you get used to sort of the slowness of it, and you have faith in yourself, because faith is this really important thing, this sort of idea that I am going to make it to the end one way or another, right? And that's really important. So I think that if you're just starting off as a writer, you might want to be a writer yourself. It's important to sort of get into the cycle where you finish things, you publish shorter things, and you work your way up into being, this person who can do the marathon of writing a book. Yeah, absolutely.
That's beautiful advice for all of us. I really appreciate that. Janet DiVincenzo has a question for you. She would like to know, are you going to write another book about U.S. intervention in El Salvador? Does that interest you as a future project?
I'm not working on that precisely about U.S. intervention in El Salvador. But I am right. My current book really is about this idea of the United States as empire and what that means if you grow up as a Latino person, right? So I think that what we are as Latino people, the only thing we can really say we all share in common, if you're Salvadoran or Mexican descent or Chicano or whatever you call yourself, is that we all have these stories that go back to empire and to the United States and its imperial ambitions. So if you're Cuban, you're here because Cuba became this dictatorship or became, this first, then communist dictatorship. And it's all about this sort of struggle, of the United States to sort of shape the world. If you're Guatemalan, right, there's incredible poverty in Guatemala caused by, the inequality, right, of this U.S. imperial system. So that's what I'm writing about now. It's sort of indirectly kind of taking on those themes about power that are in this novel. Absolutely.
Well, this is a related question from Jane Newman. She asks, is there a message for a broader reading public in this book about how U.S. Americans were seen in the world at the time that they could use to reflect on how the U.S. might be seen in the world today?
Well, yeah, that absolutely. I remember when I was starting off writing this book, I was thinking, one of the first ideas that I had in my head, because a novel to me is not just the characters and the scenes. It's this sort of like larger theme, right? This idea that you're trying to communicate. And to me, it was the idea was about what it was like, what America was like at the height of its power, right? How America, was, to be American was to have this sort of power, even individually, right? You're an individual, North American going to visit Africa. You bring with you, from the perspective of the locals, all this cultural freight, rock and roll, Chevrolets, rocket ships, computers. You stand for all these things. And so to me, that is a big part of what the book is about, right? And Joe, brings this, but he also learns to see things from the perspective of the locals because he wants to fit in, right? He wants to get shelter. He wants to get food, as Alejandra was saying, but he also wants to fit in. He wants to find a way to sort of contribute to these different causes. And so what I love about this story is the way in which it links an average, in quotes, average American Midwesterner from a college town with all of these events of the so-called third world, right? So Joe really educated himself, and that's what that's what his books were trying to do. His really poorly written books, he was trying to sort of say, look, this is out there. Part of the problem was his books were too much really about himself and not really enough about the people that he was, he wasn't really learning enough about the people that he was, visiting. He wasn't really surrendering enough of his privilege to make those books any good. But that's part of what Joe's life was about, and that's what I loved about this, is that it links these two places and it shows how we're connected, because they are connected, right? Think of what the United States is today, right? The United States is today is this incredibly diverse place that has really been populated by peoples from all over the world who are in one way refugees or have been displaced by all these different imperial projects, right? Orange County has a huge Vietnamese population. Why are the Vietnamese here? Why, right? We have a huge Korean population in this country, right? And also before that, right, we have all these different diasporas. We have this incredible, Jewish diaspora. We have the Irish migration, the German migration. So you have all these people who've come here. And so that's sort of what the story of the United States is, right? It's this place where people have come from the great crises and the great displacements caused by global capitalism, and that's definitely something that all of us as Americans need to be aware of, I think.
Well, that's probably a great place to end. I want to thank Hector and Alejandro for the wonderful conversation. I also want to thank our audience who has been faithful and engaged and interested. We are going to have more faculty book talks in the winter, including Antoinette Lafarge and David Trend from visual art, and Frank Wilderson from African American Studies, and Inez Tan from English and creative writing. So we really are very excited to be featuring, really for the first time in a systematic way, faculty authors writing on arts and culture for the Illuminations program. We are recording, we will be posting, and so you'll be able to share this with others, also see our earlier talk with John Wiener on our YouTube channel, and continue to read, listen, talk, discuss, reflect, which is what we do here at UC Irvine. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for having us, and please check out your independent bookstores or for a copy of The Last Great Road Bum. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.